Sarah Mitchell's hands trembled as she clutched her purse in the cold, imposing courtroom. The leather felt slick beneath her palms, moistened by nervous perspiration. 3 years. 3 years of fighting with David over custody of their son Tommy, and today felt different, more final, more catastrophic. She had lost count of how many court appearances she'd endured, how many times she'd sat in uncomfortable wooden chairs waiting for a judge to decide the fate of her family. Each appearance had drained her emotionally and financially, leaving her depleted and questioning whether love was enough to overcome legal systems designed to tear families apart. The morning light filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows across the mahogany benches. It was 9:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in March, and the courtroom smelled of old wood, leather-bound law books, and the faint metallic scent of air conditioning. Everything about this place felt alien and hostile, a temple where justice supposedly prevailed, but where Sarah had come to see only heartbreak and bitter battles. She had arrived 2 hours early, not because she was eager, but because anxiety had jolted her awake at dawn, her mind racing through worst-case scenarios. What if the judge sided with David? What if she lost Tommy? What if her son was forced to live primarily with a father who had proven emotionally unavailable and volatile? Judge Harrison Reeves, notorious for his ruthless efficiency and zero tolerance for emotional outbursts, was presiding over this case. Sarah had heard stories, terrifying stories whispered in lawyers' waiting rooms and shared by other mothers who had stood before him. A mother had lost complete custody of her children because she became tearful during testimony. A father had been ordered to pay support that bankrupted his small business, and Judge Reeves had shown no mercy, no flexibility. The judge's reputation preceded him like a storm cloud, dark, ominous, and unavoidable. Some said he was brilliant, others said he was heartless. Sarah suspected both were true. Tommy sat beside her, his small legs swinging nervously beneath the wooden chair, barely grazing the floor. At 5 years old, he was still too young to fully comprehend what was happening, but old enough to sense the tension radiating from his mother like heat from a furnace. His tiny fingers picked at a loose thread on his Disney character shirt, one with a cheerful Mickey Mouse that seemed mockingly inappropriate given the circumstances. He wore new shoes today, red sneakers that squeaked slightly when he fidgeted. Sarah had purchased them specifically for court, thinking that making him look fresh and well cared for might influence the judge's perception. Such desperate measures she had resorted to, as if shoes could determine a child's future. He didn't understand why Mommy and Daddy didn't live together anymore. Sarah had tried explaining it in age-appropriate terms. Sometimes grown-ups love each other in different ways, but the truth was incomprehensible to a 5-year-old. How could he grasp concepts like irreconcilable differences and incompatibility? All he knew was that his world had been split in half, that bedtime stories were sometimes read by Dad in a small apartment that smelled funny, and that Mommy cried sometimes when she thought he was sleeping. He didn't understand why they had to come to this scary place with angry voices and stern looks. The courtroom terrified him. The high ceilings made him feel small and insignificant. The formal attire worn by the lawyers and judge reminded him of authority figures who seemed to care nothing for his feelings. David sat across the aisle with his new lawyer, a sharp woman with steel-gray hair and a predatory smile. Her name was Victoria, and she had a reputation for aggressive tactics and an uncanny ability to make reasonable people sound like monsters on the witness stand. She wore an impeccably tailored suit that probably cost more than Sarah's monthly rent. David looked uncomfortable beside her, his collar visibly too tight, his jaw clenched so hard his temples pulsed. He loved Tommy, Sarah never doubted that, but love and the ability to fight effectively in family court were two different things. David had struggled financially and emotionally since the separation. He had moved into a cramped apartment, taken a lower-paying job after quitting his previous position under murky circumstances, and developed what Sarah suspected was a drinking problem, though she had no concrete proof. The tension between Sarah and David was palpable, thick enough to slice with a knife. When their eyes met briefly across the courtroom, she saw anger, regret, and desperation all warring in his expression. They had once loved each other, genuinely, deeply, but love had curdled into resentment. Disagreements had calcified into irreconcilable positions. Small frustrations had metastasized into fundamental incompatibilities. And now, 3 years of separation had created a chasm so wide that meaningful communication had become virtually impossible. The judge's gavel rested threateningly on his desk. Judge Reeves sat elevated on his bench, surrounded by the trappings of authority, the American flag to his right, the state flag to his left, portraits of previous judges lining the walls behind him. He appeared to be in his mid-60s, with silver hair slicked back severely and piercing gray eyes that seemed to judge not just the case but one's very soul. He hadn't looked up from his papers in the 5 minutes since Sarah and Tommy had entered. His complete disregard for their presence felt like a rejection, a signal that their case was just another piece of paperwork to process before lunch. Sarah had spent the previous night reviewing documents with her attorney, a kind but aging man named Robert who had taken her case partly out of principle and partly because he believed justice mattered. Robert had warned her to prepare for the worst. "Judge Reeves is unpredictable," he had said carefully. "He follows the law, but he interprets it in ways that sometimes shock both sides. You need to be prepared for any outcome." This warning had sent Sarah into a sleepless spiral of anxiety. What did any outcome mean? Could she really lose her son? The thought was unbearable, a physical pain that made her chest tight and her breathing shallow. Around them, the courtroom machinery hummed quietly. The court stenographer sat ready, fingers poised above her keyboard. 2 bailiffs stood at attention. A court clerk organized files with meticulous precision. Everything was formal, procedural, cold. This was a system designed to remove emotion, to apply logic and law to situations that were fundamentally emotional and deeply human. Sarah wondered, not for the first time, if the system was actually designed to serve children's best interests, or if it merely served the legal profession's economic interests by prolonging disputes and inflating billable hours. Tommy leaned against his mother, seeking comfort. She wrapped her arm around his small shoulders, breathing in the scent of his strawberry-scented shampoo. This was what mattered. This small boy, this precious child who had done nothing to deserve this trauma. He was innocent, yet he was suffering the consequences of adult failures and broken promises. Sarah closed her eyes briefly and sent a silent prayer to whatever universe might be listening. "Please," she begged silently, "please let him be okay. Please don't let this destroy him." The courtroom clock ticked loudly, marking each second with mechanical indifference. Judge Reeves finally looked up from his papers, his eyes sweeping across the room with the detached assessment of someone evaluating livestock. His gaze paused briefly on Tommy before moving to Sarah, then to David. In that momentary pause, Sarah thought she detected something, perhaps a flicker of recognition that a child's life hung in the balance. But it was gone almost instantly, replaced by professional neutrality. "We're ready to begin," Judge Reeves announced, his voice carrying the weight of judicial authority. His words seemed to signal the beginning of something inevitable, like the drop of an executioner's blade. Sarah's heart began to pound harder, and Tommy gripped her hand. Neither of them could have predicted that in just a few hours, everything would change in ways neither could have imagined. The proceeding had barely begun. Judge Reeves was methodically reviewing custody documentation, his expression unchanging as he shuffled through pages with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had performed this task thousands of times. His fingers traced lines of text, occasionally stopping to make notes in red ink on the margins. Sarah watched his face intently, searching for any sign of how he was leaning toward her or toward David. But his face remained an impenetrable mask, a fortress of judicial impartiality that revealed nothing. Robert, Sarah's attorney, had just begun presenting his opening statement about Tommy's bond with his mother, about the importance of stability and maternal presence in a child's formative years. His voice was calm and measured, hitting points they had rehearsed multiple times. "Your Honor, The evidence will show that Tommy thrives when his primary care is provided by his mother. His school records demonstrate improved academic performance during periods when he spends more time with. Judge Reeves raised his hand slightly, cutting Robert off mid-sentence. "We'll hear all arguments in due time, mister. Please proceed methodically." It wasn't rude, but it wasn't warm either. It was the tone of a man with limited patience and countless cases waiting behind this one. Robert nodded, chastened, and continued his presentation. Sarah felt her stomach twist into knots. The judge seemed annoyed already, and they had barely started. She squeezed Tommy's hand reassuringly, though she desperately needed reassurance herself. Victoria sat at her table with the smugness of someone who had successfully won custody battles before. She had filed 12 motions in the past 6 months alone, each one designed to complicate Sarah's case and make her look unstable or unfit. One motion questioned Sarah's financial stability. Another suggested she had missed appointments with Tommy. A third alleged emotional instability, though it was based on gossip from David's new girlfriend, not actual evidence. Victoria had weaponized the legal system with precision and ruthlessness, and Sarah had watched her son's future become a chess piece in an elaborate game neither of them had chosen to play. Then, unexpectedly, the courtroom doors at the rear swung open with sudden force. The sound reverberated through the quiet room like a gunshot, startling everyone. Judge Reeves looked up sharply, irritation crossing his features at the interruption. Sarah turned her head instinctively, along with everyone else in the room. What she saw in that moment would become the pivotal point in her family's history, though she didn't know it yet. Officer entered through the doors, but he didn't walk alone. Beside him, moving with deliberate grace and composed dignity, was Duke, a magnificent German Shepherd police dog whose presence seemed to make the entire courtroom smaller. The dog was massive, easily standing 3 feet tall at the shoulder, his coat a rich tan and black pattern that gleamed under the courtroom's fluorescent lights. His official police badge hung from his collar, and his bearing conveyed an air of calm authority and gentle competence. Every step he took was measured and controlled, a product of years of intensive training and discipline. Officer was a middle-aged man with the bearing of someone who had spent decades in law enforcement. He had kind eyes that contradicted the authority of his uniform, and he wore his years of experience with quiet pride. His badge read K9 Unit, and beneath it the number 347, indicating his years of service. Behind him came 2 additional uniformed officers who moved efficiently to the side of the courtroom. They carried folders and appeared to be setting up for testimony, likely related to the sensitive witness case Judge Reeves had mentioned in the pre-trial briefing. The courtroom's entire atmosphere shifted in an instant. It was as if someone had changed the frequency on a television set. The tension that had permeated the room moments before seemed to dissipate, replaced by something else, a sense of calm purpose, of something larger than individual grievances entering the space. The bailiff straightened. The court stenographer paused in her rhythmic typing. Even Judge Reeves' stern expression softened almost imperceptibly, though he quickly caught himself and resumed his formal demeanor. Tommy's nervous fidgeting stopped completely, instantaneously, as if a switch had been flipped in his small body. His leg, which had been swinging anxiously beneath the wooden chair, stilled. His fingers, which had been twisting that loose thread on his Mickey Mouse shirt, released it. His eyes, which had been darting around the courtroom with undefined anxiety, locked onto the dog with singular focus and wonder. Sarah felt the change in her son immediately. She had spent 3 years learning to read his moods, to understand his fears and comfort him through his anxieties. She recognized this moment as something profoundly different. It wasn't just that Tommy was distracted. It was that something in his entire being had recognized a source of safety and authenticity. The dog was real in a way nothing else in this cold, sterile courtroom was real. Duke wasn't performing a role or representing an agenda. Duke wasn't angry or bitter or fighting for something. Duke simply existed as a presence of calm, peaceful competence. As Officer and Duke walked slowly down the center aisle of the courtroom, moving toward the front where they would take their position for the upcoming testimony, Sarah watched her son's transformation with amazement. Tommy's face, which had been pale and tense moments before, began to flush with color. His breathing, which had been shallow and anxious, deepened and slowed. Most remarkably, a genuine smile spread across his small face. Not a brave smile or a forced smile, but a real smile of pure, uncomplicated joy at witnessing something beautiful and powerful. The dog moved with such grace, such intentional presence. Every seemed deliberate. His head remained alert but calm, his ears positioned to receive sounds from all directions. His tail, though not wagging rapidly, moved with a slow, confident rhythm. He was the picture of disciplined training combined with gentle authority, a being who knew his purpose and approached it with quiet dignity. Several people in the courtroom seemed to experience what Tommy was experiencing. Sarah noticed David's tension ease slightly. She saw Victoria's aggressive posture relax just incrementally. Even Judge Reeves appeared to have lost some of his severity, his features softening as he observed the dog. There was something about Duke's presence that transcended the adversarial nature of the room, something that reminded everyone that they were humans first and legal combatants second. Tommy's head turned to follow Duke's movement, his eyes never leaving the magnificent animal. Sarah could almost see the anxiety draining from her son like water from a basin. The courtroom noise, the rustling of papers, the occasional cough, the creaking of chairs, all seemed to fade into background static. Tommy's entire world had narrowed to one point, the dog walking past him, moving forward with purpose and presence. Officer positioned Duke to the side of the courtroom, preparing the dog for his role as a comfort presence during the upcoming sensitive witness testimony. But the dog's impact had already been felt. The room had been transformed from a battlefield into something more human, more hopeful. Judge Reeves settled back into his chair, his expression still formal but perhaps less harsh than before. Victoria shuffled papers with less aggressive energy. And Tommy, sweet, anxious Tommy, sat in his chair, his small hand still gripping his mother's, but now with the grip of someone finding solid ground after treading water. Sarah could not have known that this moment, this simple arrival of a police dog and his handler, was about to change everything. She could not have predicted that Duke's presence would become the catalyst for a transformation that would shake the foundations of her custody case and force Judge Reeves himself to confront something he had hidden from for 30 years behind robes and judicial procedure. In that moment, though, she simply held her son's hand and felt grateful for this unexpected respite from anxiety. She felt her own heartbeat slow to match the dog's calm presence. She breathed deeper, and without understanding why, she felt something shift in the universe, a crack in the dam, a first indication that perhaps, just perhaps, this day would not end the way she had feared. The courtroom had settled into a strange new equilibrium. Officer had positioned Duke near the side of the bench, preparing him for his role as a therapeutic presence during the sensitive witness testimony. The dog sat in perfect posture, his legs positioned at precise right angles, his head alert but calm. Years of training had instilled in Duke an almost meditative quality, the ability to be fully present and aware while remaining perfectly still. He was a living embodiment of discipline and peace. Judge Reeves had resumed his review of case documents. Victoria was organizing her notes for cross-examination, her sharp features arranged in calculated confidence. Robert had paused his opening statement, waiting for the judge's signal to continue. The courtroom had returned to something resembling order, though an undercurrent of something different, something changed, flowed beneath the surface. The dog's presence had infiltrated the proceedings like a balm, temporarily soothing the adversarial wounds. But Tommy couldn't stop looking at Duke. His head remained turned toward the dog even as his mother squeezed his hand gently, a subtle signal to face forward and pay attention to the proceedings. Sarah had explained to Tommy before they came that he needed to be quiet and still in the courtroom. "We have to let the grown-ups talk," she had said. This is a very serious place where the judge makes important decisions. Tommy had nodded solemnly, understanding that this place was different from school or home, that different rules applied here. But those instructions seemed to dissolve in the presence of the dog. Duke represented something pure and uncomplicated in a room full of complex emotions and hidden agendas. Everyone in the courtroom was performing a role, the judge performing impartiality, the attorneys performing zealous advocacy, the parents performing fitness and stability. But the dog simply existed. He was authentically present in a way nothing else in the room was authentic. Then, in a moment that would alter the trajectory of events, something extraordinary happened. As Officer and Duke began to move toward the witness stand to position themselves for the upcoming testimony, they passed by the bench where Sarah and Tommy sat. It was a simple movement, part of the routine workflow of the courtroom. But Tommy, driven by something deeper than obedience or fear, suddenly stood up. His small frame rose from the wooden chair with sudden determination, his 5-year-old body apparently unable to contain what his heart was feeling. His tiny voice cut through the courtroom silence like a bell, pure, clear, and utterly unexpected. "Hi, friend," he whispered, his words barely audible but carrying such tenderness and longing that everyone in the room seemed to hear them simultaneously. It was as if Tommy had spoken not just with his mouth but with his entire being, his entire desperate, searching soul. The phrase was simple, a greeting a child might give to anyone. But in that moment, in that cold courtroom on that March morning, it sounded like a prayer. The room held its breath. Sarah's grip on her son's hand tightened, though whether in surprise or instinctive restraint she couldn't say. She looked up at her attorney, expecting to see disapproval or concern that Tommy had violated courtroom protocol. But Robert's expression was unreadable, his attention fixed on what was about to unfold. Judge Reeves looked up from his papers, his eyes narrowing with what might have been irritation at the interruption, or perhaps something else entirely. Tommy's small hand reached out tentatively toward the dog, his arm extending in a gesture of offering, of invitation, of reaching across the gulf that separated his small childhood world from the adult machinery of justice. His fingers trembled slightly, vulnerable and exposed, a 5-year-old's gesture of trust and longing directed at a creature he had never met but somehow recognized as trustworthy. Officer seemed to understand what was happening. He could have continued walking, could have gently redirected Duke past the boy. Standard protocol would have suggested removing the distraction immediately, but Officer possessed something beyond standard protocol. He possessed wisdom. He recognized that something sacred was trying to happen, something that transcended the normal rules of courtroom conduct. He slowed Duke's pace, allowing the dog to turn his magnificent head toward the child. Duke's eyes met Tommy's eyes. In that moment, something shifted in the universe. It was as if two souls had recognized each other across a divide they didn't understand but somehow knew needed to be crossed. The dog, trained and disciplined and shaped by years of professional service, seemed to recognize in Tommy a kindred loneliness, a being suffering in silence, trapped in circumstances beyond his control, seeking connection and understanding in a world that seemed hostile and confusing. Duke didn't bark or jump or display typical dog excitement. Instead, he moved toward Tommy slowly, deliberately, with the careful grace of someone approaching something precious and fragile. His massive body, which could have seemed threatening to a 5-year-old, moved with such gentleness that it appeared almost reverent. His tail began to wag, not frantically but with slow, deliberate sweeps that seemed to say, "I see you. I understand. You are safe with me." And then Tommy began to speak. His words tumbled out like water from a broken dam, like something that had been up for months was finally finding an outlet. His voice grew stronger, more confident, as if the dog's presence was somehow unlocking chambers of his heart that had been sealed shut by fear and confusion. "I miss Daddy," he said, his voice cracking slightly with emotion. "But I don't like when Mommy and Daddy yell. It makes my tummy hurt." His small hand buried itself in Duke's thick fur, and he continued, his words becoming a stream of consciousness, a confession of childhood trauma that had no other outlet, no other witness who would listen without agenda or defense. I don't understand why Daddy has a new apartment. I don't understand why Mommy cries when she thinks I'm sleeping. I don't like going back and forth. I don't like being asked who I love more because I love both the same amount. His 5-year-old voice carried a sophistication beyond his years, the clear articulation of a child desperately trying to make sense of an adult world that had shattered around him. The courtroom had transformed into something entirely different. It was no longer a place of legal procedure and adversarial combat. It was a sacred space, a confessional booth where a child was finally speaking his truth to an audience that included not just his parents and their attorneys, but a judge, court officers, and one remarkable dog whose very presence seemed to give the child permission to speak what had been unspoken for so long. The court stenographer's fingers had frozen above her keyboard. She was not typing, though she should have been. This was testimony, real testimony, the most important testimony that would ever be spoken in this courtroom. Victoria's calculated expression had cracked, revealing something underneath, a flicker of humanity, a recognition that something deeper than legal strategy was happening. David, Tommy's father, had his face in his hands, his shoulders trembling with what looked like suppressed emotion. Sarah was crying silently, tears streaming down her face as she watched her son, her precious son, finally articulate the pain he had been carrying alone. She had tried to shield him from the worst of the separation, had tried to be strong and capable and not let him see her despair. But Tommy had been carrying the weight regardless, and now, in the presence of a dog and a courtroom full of people, he was finally releasing it. Judge Reeves sat motionless on his bench, his judicial expression completely dissolved. His face showed something raw and unguarded, perhaps empathy, perhaps recognition of his own limitations in understanding what really mattered in a custody case. His hands, which had been moving through paperwork moments before, were now still. His eyes were fixed on Tommy and Duke, absorbing every word, every gesture, every tear that rolled down the small boy's cheeks. Tommy wrapped his small arms around Duke's neck, his face burying itself in the dog's fur. His tiny body seemed to find in that embrace something that had been missing, not just comfort, but validation. Someone was listening. Someone cared. Someone understood without judgment or agenda that he was hurt and scared and desperately wanted things to be different. In that moment, everything changed. Judge Harrison Reeves had built his entire career on discipline, distance, and detachment. For 30 years, he had sat on the bench, maintaining a carefully constructed wall between himself and the human dramas that unfolded before him daily. He had learned early in his judicial career that emotional involvement was a liability. It clouded judgment, created bias, and complicated the pure application of law. He had trained himself to listen to testimony with the objectivity of a computer processing data, to absorb arguments without letting them penetrate the professional armor he had constructed around his heart. He had divorced twice. He had missed his own children's important moments, soccer games, school plays, graduations, because he was hearing cases. He had chosen law over love, precedent over passion, justice over joy. And he had justified all of it by telling himself that his work mattered, that his careful application of legal principles was more important than personal relationships or emotional needs. He had become the archetypal judge, brilliant, accomplished, respected, and utterly isolated. Now, at 64 years old, watching a 5-year-old boy speak his truth to a dog in a courtroom, Judge Reeves felt something shift deep within his chest. It was not a comfortable feeling. It was something like a rupture in a carefully maintained dam, a crack in the fortress he had spent decades constructing. Tommy's words continued to pour out, each one landing like a stone in still water, creating ripples that spread outward to touch everyone present. I love Mommy and Daddy. I just want them to stop being sad and angry. The child's voice trembled with an emotion so genuine, so pure, that it was impossible to dismiss or diminish. This was not a rehearsed statement. This was not testimony coached by an attorney. This was the unfiltered emotional truth of a 5-year-old child whose world had been shattered by adult failures. Judge Reeves slowly lowered his pen. He had been holding it in a writing position, ready to take notes on the proceedings, but his hand had gone still. The pen hung suspended between his palm and the bench, forgotten. His eyes, which had looked at countless testimonies and arguments with cool analysis, were now focused entirely on Tommy and the dog. Something in his expression began to shift. It was subtle at first, a relaxation of the muscles around his jaw, a softening of the hard line between his eyebrows, a momentary closing of his eyes as if he were processing something too large for words. When he opened them again, they were different. The judicial coldness that had characterized his gaze for 3 decades seemed to have cracked, revealing something underneath that had been hidden for a very long time. Officer noticed the change in the judge's expression. He had worked with therapy dogs for 20 years and had witnessed countless moments of transformation. He recognized what was happening. A wall was coming down. A heart that had been guarded was opening. The officer stood quietly, allowing the moment to unfold, his hand resting gently on Duke's back. He had learned long ago that sometimes the most important thing a person could do was nothing, simply allow space for truth and transformation to occur. Sarah was acutely aware of the judge's reaction. Her eyes darted toward the bench, studying his face intently. In 30 years of adulthood, she had learned to read people, their moods, their intentions, their hidden agendas. And what she saw now in Judge Reeves' expression was something she had not expected: vulnerability. The formidable judge who had terrified her for weeks was, in this moment, allowing his professional mask to slip. David had lifted his face from his hands. He was watching his son with an expression that combined devastating love, profound guilt, and terrible regret. His new attorney, Victoria, had ceased her confident posturing. She sat rigidly in her chair, her mouth slightly open, her earlier aggressive energy completely dissipated. Whatever legal strategy she had carefully constructed seemed suddenly irrelevant in the face of this raw display of childhood truth. Judge Reeves' entire body seemed to be processing an internal earthquake. His hands, which had always moved with deliberate, controlled precision, began to tremble slightly. He set down his pen deliberately, as if the act required concentration. He removed his glasses, something he rarely did in public, and rubbed his eyes with the heels of his palms. For a moment, he looked not like a judge, but like an old man confronting something he had avoided for too long. The judge's mind was spinning through decades of cases, hundreds of custody hearings, thousands of decisions rendered with careful legal analysis and measured consideration. He had prided himself on applying the law fairly, on avoiding the trap of emotional decision-making. He had criticized other judges who let their hearts rule their heads. He had published articles in legal journals about the importance of judicial detachment and objective analysis. But now, watching this small child speak with an emotional clarity that no attorney's argument could match, Judge Reeves found himself questioning everything he had believed about his own work. How many children had stood before him, silent and suffering, their deepest needs utterly invisible to his methodical analysis? How many custody decisions had he rendered based on financial stability and legal precedent, while missing the fundamental emotional reality that children needed their parents to be sane, responsible, and motivated by love rather than anger? His own children's faces flashed through his memory. His oldest daughter, now 38, whom he had spoken to only 3 times in the past 5 years. His son, now 35, who had written to him years ago asking why his father had seemed more interested in the law than in his own family. His youngest, a daughter now 30, who had invited him to her wedding but whom he had sent a generous check instead of attending, due to a case he deemed more important. He had rationalized those decisions. He had told himself he was building a legacy of justice. But was it justice if it came at the cost of destroying the people he loved? Tommy was still speaking, his words continuing to penetrate the armor of judicial detachment. "I don't like having to choose. I don't like it when mommy says bad things about daddy, and I don't like it when daddy looks sad about mommy. I just want to be a kid. I just want everyone to stop being broken." The last phrase hung in the air like a benediction. I just want everyone to stop being broken. Judge Reeves felt tears beginning to form in his eyes. He blinked them back, struggling to maintain some semblance of professional composure. But the dam that had held for 30 years was cracking more deeply. A 5-year-old child, in the space of 5 minutes, had accomplished what no attorney argument, no legal brief, no academic paper could have accomplished. This child had spoken a truth so fundamental, so universal, so deeply human that it transcended legal categories and judicial analysis. Tommy continued to hold Duke, his small arms wrapped around the dog's neck, his face pressed against the dog's fur. The dog remained perfectly still, perfectly present, asking nothing and offering everything. In that moment, the dog seemed to understand something that Judge Reeves was just beginning to comprehend. That sometimes the most important work anyone could do was simply to bear witness to pain, to validate it, to offer silent presence to someone who was suffering. Judge Reeves looked at his own hands. These were the hands that had signed custody orders. These hands had wielded power over families, over children, over lives. These hands had rendered judgment for 30 years. And in this moment, these hands felt utterly inadequate, utterly insufficient for the task he had been performing all these years. He looked at Tommy. He looked at Duke. He looked at the officers, the attorneys, the court personnel. He looked at Sarah's tear-stained face and David's expression of devastated recognition. In that look, Judge Reeves made a decision that would transform not just this case, but perhaps his understanding of what justice truly meant. He slowly placed his glasses back on his face, but everything he saw now looked different. He saw not legal positions but human suffering. He saw not precedent but possibility. He saw not a custody case but a family in pain that needed healing, not judgment. "We're going to take a recess," Judge Reeves announced quietly. His voice was different, still authoritative, but softer, more human. 30 minutes. Everyone in my chambers. We need to talk about something important. Officer, would you and Duke please join us?" The judge's chambers were a room frozen in time. Dark wood paneling covered the walls, lined with law books that had been referenced countless times over 3 decades. A massive mahogany desk dominated the space, its surface cluttered with case files, legal pads, and the accumulated detritus of judicial responsibility. Behind the desk hung diplomas and certificates, evidence of Judge Reeves' academic achievements and professional accomplishments. To the left stood a small liquor cabinet, rarely opened, a remnant from an earlier era when judicial entertainment was considered appropriate. The overall effect was one of authority, tradition, and isolation, a room designed to intimidate rather than comfort. But today, this room would witness something unprecedented. Judge Reeves sat heavily in his leather chair, suddenly looking every one of his 64 years. The composed judicial demeanor that had served him for 3 decades had evaporated, replaced by something and more genuine. His hands rested on his desk, and he stared at them as if they belonged to someone else entirely. The recess had lasted only 15 minutes before everyone had assembled in his chambers at his unusual request. Sarah sat on one side of the room with Tommy, who clutched a bottle of water that one of the court officers had provided. Robert stood nearby, his expression one of careful neutrality, though his eyes betrayed his surprise at this extraordinary deviation from standard procedure. David and Victoria occupied the other side of the room, a geographical reminder of the adversarial nature that had defined this case. David looked shell-shocked, as if the morning's events had fundamentally destabilized his understanding of what this hearing was supposed to accomplish. Victoria's earlier aggression had transformed into careful observation. She was calculating, trying to understand how to salvage her client's case in light of these unexpected developments. Officer stood with Duke positioned calmly beside him. The dog seemed to understand the gravity of the moment. his posture alert but peaceful. His presence alone seemed to shift something in the room's energy, softening the adversarial sharpness that typically characterized judicial proceedings. Duke's eyes moved occasionally between the different people present, as if assessing their emotional states. Judge Reeves looked up slowly, his gaze moving from one person to another. "Before we proceed, I want to speak candidly with Officer, alone. Everyone else, please give us the room for 5 minutes." His voice carried the authority of his office, but there was something different about it now, a quality of genuine human connection beneath the judicial formality. Sarah exchanged a worried glance with Robert as they filed out of the chambers, moving into an adjacent waiting room. David followed, with Victoria close behind, both of them whispering urgently to each other. Only Officer and Duke remained. Judge Reeves gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Please, Officer, sit down. I need to understand something." Officer sat, Duke settling beside him with practiced composure. The judge leaned forward, his elbows resting on his desk, his fingers steepled before his face, a gesture of concentration rather than authority. "I've been a judge for 30 years, Judge Reeves began, his voice quiet. "I've rendered hundreds of custody decisions. I've prided myself on applying the law fairly and objectively. But this morning, I watched a 5-year-old child speak with more clarity about his emotional needs than I've heard from adults in therapy for years. And I watched your dog facilitate that clarity." He paused, seeming to struggle with the words. "I need you to help me understand what I witnessed. I need you to help me understand what I've been missing all these years." Officer met the judge's eyes steadily. He had worked with therapy dogs long enough to understand the science and art of what they did, but he also understood that the most powerful explanations were always rooted in human experience rather than technical detail. "Your Honor," Officer began carefully, "therapy dogs like Duke operate on a principle that's fundamental to human nature. We all have defense mechanisms, ways we protect ourselves from emotional vulnerability. Kids especially develop these defenses as a survival mechanism. Tommy had built walls around his pain because the adults in his life were in conflict. He couldn't trust that his feelings would be heard or validated, so he buried them." The judge nodded slowly, absorbing this. Officer continued, gesturing gently toward Duke. "What Duke does is he short-circuits those defense mechanisms. He doesn't represent the legal system or anyone's agenda. He doesn't judge. He doesn't have to win an argument or prove a point. He simply exists as a non-threatening presence that communicates through his very being, 'You are safe here. Your feelings matter.' When a child is in that presence, something inside them that's been locked away is given permission to emerge." Judge Reeves was silent for a long moment, absorbing the weight of this explanation. "So what Tommy said, that wasn't coached or manipulated?" "Not in any way," Officer said firmly. "That was the expression of his emotional truth that he's probably been able to articulate since his parents separated. Most kids live with that pain silently because they don't feel safe expressing it. Duke gave him that safety." The judge removed his glasses again, and this time he didn't try to hide the moisture in his eyes. "I've spent 30 years thinking that objectivity and detachment were the tools of justice. But this morning, I realized I may have been solving the wrong problem. I've been so focused on applying the law correctly that I've missed the opportunity to address the actual human needs that created the legal conflict in the first place." Officer waited respectfully for the judge to continue. "Here's what I'm thinking," Judge Reeves said, his voice growing stronger with conviction. "I want to conduct this custody hearing differently. I want to allow Duke to remain in the courtroom while I speak informally with Tommy, not in the adversarial format we typically use, something more intimate, more human. I want to hear from Tommy what he actually needs without the formal legal framework. Would that be possible?" Officer nodded thoughtfully. "It's unusual, Your Honor, but yes, it's absolutely possible. Duke would be a calming presence. Tommy would likely be more open and honest than informal testimony." "What about from a legal standpoint?" Judge Reeves asked. Could this impact the admissibility of what he says? I would recommend documenting it carefully, officer said. Having the court stenographer record everything. Being transparent with both attorneys that this is a therapeutic consultation, not formal testimony, but that you'll be considering what you learn in your decision. If both attorneys consent, it's entirely within your authority as a judge to modify standard procedure. Judge Reeves nodded decisively. He stood and moved toward the door, then paused. Officer, I want to thank you. You've done more for this family in the last hour than I've accomplished in 30 years of judicial service. I don't say that lightly. Officer stood as well. With respect, Your Honor, Duke did that. I just showed up with him. The dog did the work. He paused, then added, but I think what's more important is that you heard what needed to be heard. That takes courage. Judge Reeves opened the door and summoned everyone back into his chambers. When they had all reassembled, he announced his unusual decision with remarkable clarity and conviction. I'm going to invoke an extraordinary procedure, he said, addressing the room. We're going to conduct an informal conversation with Tommy while Officer Duke remains present as a calming presence. This will be documented by the court stenographer, but it will not be formal adversarial testimony. It will be a therapeutic consultation designed to understand what this child actually needs. The purpose is to gain insight that will inform my custody decision. Victoria immediately objected. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. This could compromise the legal integrity of. But Sarah's attorney interrupted. Your Honor, I believe this serves the best interests of the child, which is what this case should be about. Judge Reeves looked directly at the two attorneys. I understand the irregularity, but I also understand that standard procedure has failed to accomplish what matters most in this case, understanding what this 5-year-old child actually needs from the adults responsible for his care. Both of you will have opportunity to respond to anything said during this consultation, but this is happening. Are we clear? The authority in his voice was absolute. There would be no further objections. The courtroom had been transformed. The formal judicial atmosphere, with all its intimidating apparatus of authority and procedure, had been replaced by something warmer and more intimate. Judge Reeves had removed his robe, a symbolic action that seemed to signal a fundamental shift in the nature of what was about to occur. He had repositioned himself at a lower level, moving from behind his elevated bench to a chair placed at Tommy's eye level. The court stenographer sat nearby, her fingers poised over her keyboard, ready to record every word. Officer and Duke positioned themselves at the side, close enough to provide Tommy's security blanket but not so close as to be intrusive. Tommy sat in a comfortable chair, his small feet not quite reaching the floor, dangling slightly above the polished wood. His hand was buried in Duke's thick fur, fingers moving gently through the dog's coat in a repetitive, soothing motion. The dog remained perfectly still, his massive body a source of stability and calm in a room that could have been terrifying for a 5-year-old. Judge Reeves began with extraordinary gentleness, his voice modulated to a tone most people in the courtroom had never heard from him before. It was the voice of a grandfather rather than a judge, of someone genuinely interested in understanding rather than pronouncing judgment. Tommy, can you tell me what makes you feel safe? The judge asked, leaning slightly forward. His expression was open and attentive, devoid of the stern authority that typically characterized his demeanor. For Tommy, who had spent months in the presence of adults arguing and fighting, this kindness felt almost shocking. Tommy was quiet for a moment, his fingers continuing their gentle motion through Duke's fur. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he began to speak. Duke makes me feel safe, and Mommy's hugs, and when Daddy reads me stories before bed. His words were simple, but they carried profound weight. In 3 short sentences, he had identified the things that mattered most to him: a dog, his mother's physical affection, and his father's emotional presence. Judge Reeves nodded slowly, absorbing each word as if it were precious testimony. Those are beautiful things, Tommy. Those are things that matter very much. He paused, allowing space for Tommy's words to settle. What makes you feel scared? The question hung in the air. It was vulnerable to ask a child what frightened him, especially in a room full of adults. But Judge Reeves had learned something this morning that had taken him 30 years to understand. Asking the right questions with genuine compassion was the foundation of true justice. Tommy's grip on Duke's fur tightened slightly. His voice became barely a whisper, as if the words themselves were difficult to speak aloud, as if numbing the fear might make it more real. When Mommy and Daddy yell at each other, it feels like the whole world is breaking. It makes my chest hurt. It makes it hard to breathe. His small shoulders hunched slightly as he spoke, his entire body reflecting the anxiety that the memory of his parents' conflict caused him. In the gallery, Sarah covered her mouth. David's face crumpled. They were hearing their son describe with startling clarity the damage their conflict was inflicting on him. The truth was painful, perhaps the most painful truth they had ever heard, but it was undeniable. Judge Reeves let the silence sit for a moment before asking his next question. Tommy, do you love your daddy? The response was immediate and absolute. So much, Tommy said, his voice growing stronger. So much. I miss him when he's not there. I think about him during the day. I want to tell him things that happened to me. As he spoke, Tommy's eyes filled with tears, though he didn't cry. The tears simply accumulated, reflecting the overhead lights. Do you love your mommy? Judge Reeves asked gently. The most, Tommy replied instantly. I love her the most, but I love Daddy too. I don't like having to love one more than the other. It makes me feel bad inside, like I'm doing something wrong. But I can't love them the same. I try, but they both feel so big and important. The honesty in those words was devastating. Here was a 5-year-old articulating something that many children of divorce struggle with in silence. The impossible feeling of being divided, of having to choose, of not being able to simply love both parents without guilt or confusion. Judge Reeves leaned slightly closer, his voice growing even softer. What do you want more than anything, Tommy? If you could have anything in the world, what would it be? This was the pivotal question, the one that would cut through all the legal arguments and technical considerations to reveal what actually mattered. Tommy was quiet for a long time, his hand stilled in Duke's fur. His eyes moved away from the judge and looked down at the dog beside him. When he finally spoke, his voice was clear and unwavering despite his age. I want Mommy and Daddy to not be mad anymore. I want to see them both. I want to be happy again. I want everyone to stop being broken. The courtroom seemed to pause. Even the ambient sounds, the ventilation system, the distant noise of the courthouse hallway, seemed to fade away. Those 9 words encapsulated everything that mattered in this custody case. It wasn't about legal strategy or financial considerations or which parent had the superior claim. It was about a child's desperate desire for his fractured world to become whole again. Judge Reeves' eyes glistened with tears. He removed his glasses slowly, pressing his fingers against his eyes for a moment before replacing them. When he looked back at Tommy, his expression had transformed entirely. This was not the judge who had intimidated countless litigants. This was a human being confronting the consequences of the legal system he had spent his career administering. Tommy, Judge Reeves said carefully, I need you to know that what you've told me today is very important. You've been very brave to speak your feelings. You've helped me understand something that I should have understood a long time ago. Tommy nodded solemnly, as if he understood on some intuitive level that his words had weight and significance beyond his years. The judge turned slightly toward Officer. Officer, I want to continue this conversation, but I want to ask you something. Based on your experience with children and therapy dogs, do you believe Tommy has been able to speak his truth here today? Officer met the judge's eyes steadily. Completely, Your Honor. This is the most open and honest I've ever seen a child in his situation. Duke gave him permission to be authentic. The judge gave him safety through compassion. Those two things together created an environment where he could speak what he truly feels. Judge Reeves nodded, then looked back at Tommy. "Thank you, buddy. Thank you for being so brave and so honest. I'm going to think very carefully about everything you've told me today, because what you need matters more than anything else in this courtroom. Do you understand?" Tommy nodded. "Will Mommy and Daddy stop being broken?" he asked. The question was so direct, so innocent, that it carried almost unbearable weight. Judge Reeves took a moment before responding. "I'm going to do everything I can to help with that. That's my job now, to help your Mommy and Daddy understand how to take care of you better, to help them stop the things that hurt you and start the things that make you feel safe. Can I ask for your help with that?" "How?" Tommy asked. "By being just as honest with them as you've been with me," Judge Reeves said. "And by knowing that when they seem broken, it's not your job to fix them. It's their job to fix themselves. Do you understand the difference?" Tommy thought about this carefully. "I think so," he said finally. "It means it's not my fault." "That's exactly right," Judge Reeves said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's absolutely not your fault. None of this is your fault." Sarah was openly crying now, her face in her hands. David had stood up and moved to the window, his shoulders shaking with the effort of containing his emotions. Even Victoria, the sharp and aggressive attorney, looked visibly shaken by the raw authenticity of what had just transpired. Officer placed his hand gently on Duke's head. The dog, sensing the profound emotional shift in the room, pressed slightly against Tommy, offering his silent presence. Judge Reeves stood slowly, as if the weight of what he had just heard had added years to his body. "We're going to take another recess. I need time to process what I've heard and to consider how to proceed. Everyone will reconvene in my courtroom at 2 p.m. At that time, I will render my decision on this custody case." He looked directly at Tommy. "Thank you, young man. You have changed today. You have changed today for me, and I suspect you have changed today for your parents as well. That takes real strength." Recess had lasted 3 hours. It was now 1:55 p.m., 5 minutes before the scheduled reconvening of the court. The courtroom had filled once again with the key players in this custody drama. Sarah sat on one side with her attorney Robert, her hands folded in her lap, her expression a mixture of hope and dread. David occupied the opposite side with Victoria, who had been unusually quiet since the morning's proceedings. Tommy sat between his mother and his grandmother, who had arrived during the recess, alerted to the extraordinary nature of the day's events. Officer and Duke were present as well, though they occupied a more peripheral position. The dog had been instrumental in the morning's transformation, and Judge Reeves had specifically requested their presence for the final decision. Duke seemed to sense the gravity of the moment. He sat with perfect posture, his eyes alert but calm, his presence somehow grounding everyone around him. The courtroom was packed in a way it hadn't been that morning. Word had spread through the courthouse about the unusual proceedings. Law students had gathered in the back, interested in witnessing this extraordinary deviation from standard judicial protocol. Other judges' clerks had drifted in, curious about what had caused such an unconventional approach. The media had caught wind of the story, a custody case involving a therapy dog that had seemingly transformed a notoriously strict judge. 2 reporters sat in the gallery, their cameras and notepads ready. At exactly 2:00 p.m., Judge Reeves entered through the door behind the bench, but something had changed about him that was visible to everyone present. During the recess, he had remained in his chambers, wrestling with the implications of what he had learned. His typically rigid posture seemed slightly softer. His expression, while still authoritative, carried a weight of profound contemplation. He had changed into a fresh robe, but everyone could sense that something more fundamental than his clothing had been transformed. He settled into his chair slowly, deliberately. He did not immediately look at the case files before him. Instead, he let his gaze move across the courtroom, at Sarah, at David, at Tommy, at Officer and Duke, at the gathered crowd of observers. It was as if he was acknowledging the significance of what was about to occur, the fact that this moment would matter not just to the people directly involved, but to everyone witnessing it. In my 30 years as a judge, Judge Reeves began, his voice carrying through the courtroom with remarkable clarity and conviction, I have listened to countless arguments, legal theories, and custody strategies. I have reviewed financial documents, employment records, and psychological evaluations. I have applied the law as I understood it, always striving for what I believed was justice. He paused, letting those words settle. But today, I learned something that no law school could teach me. Today, I learned what actually matters in a custody case. He removed his glasses deliberately, a gesture that had become symbolic throughout the day. His eyes, now unshielded, showed the depth of emotion that lay beneath his judicial demeanor. This morning, a 5-year-old child spoke with more clarity about his emotional needs than I have heard from countless adults in therapy for decades. That child articulated something fundamental that this legal system often misses, that children do not need parents who are fighting for custody. They need parents who are working together to provide safety, stability, and unconditional love. Sarah felt tears beginning to form. She wasn't sure what decision was coming, but the judge's tone suggested something unprecedented. This custody case is not about what is best for the parents, Judge Reeves continued. This custody case is about what is best for Tommy, and Tommy has spoken. He has told us in his own words what he needs. He needs to see both his parents. He needs them to stop the conflict that is causing him emotional damage. He needs to know with absolute certainty that he is not responsible for the pain of his family's separation. Judge Reeves placed his glasses back on and opened the case file before him. I am now rendering my decision. First, regarding custody arrangement, Sarah Mitchell will have primary custody during the school week, Monday through Friday. David Mitchell will have custody every other weekend, from Friday evening through Sunday evening. Additionally, David will have custody on Tuesday and Wednesday evenings, from 4 p.m. to 8 p.m., allowing him consistent midweek contact with his son. He paused, allowing the lawyers to absorb the custody structure. This arrangement was fairly standard, nothing revolutionary so far, but Judge Reeves' expression suggested the most important part was yet to come. However, this custody arrangement comes with conditions that I believe are essential to Tommy's. Both parents will immediately enroll in mandatory family therapy with a licensed family counselor. This is not optional. This is required by this court. The purpose is not punishment. The purpose is education. You will learn how to co-parent effectively. You will learn how to manage conflict in ways that protect your child from emotional damage. You will learn how to communicate with respect and dignity, even when you disagree. Victoria shifted uncomfortably, clearly sensing that this was not going to be a clean victory for her client. Judge Reeves continued without pause. Both parents will also complete an anger management course. Again, this is mandatory. I am not making this determination because either of you is a bad person or a bad parent. I am making this determination because this child has made clear that parental conflict is causing him significant emotional harm. It is your responsibility to address that. He looked directly at David. Mr. Mitchell, your son loves you with absolute clarity and without reservation. He misses you. He wants to spend time with you, but he needs you present and emotionally functional. He needs you to manage your own struggles in ways that do not place emotional burdens on him. Do you understand? David nodded, his jaw tight, his eyes glistening. Judge Reeves then turned his gaze to Sarah. Mrs. Mitchell, the same applies to you. Your son loves you equally. He needs your presence and support. But he also needs you to refrain from speaking negatively about his father, from placing him in situations where he feels he must choose between you. He needs both of his parents to demonstrate maturity and commitment to his, not to your own grievances. Do you understand? Sarah nodded, tears streaming freely down her face. Furthermore, Judge Reeves continued, his voice growing more forceful. "I am implementing a monitoring system. In 6 months, I will review your progress in therapy. In 1 year, I will conduct a follow-up hearing to assess Tommy's emotional state and to determine if this custody arrangement continues to serve his best interests. If either of you violates this agreement, if either of you continues toxic behavior toward the other parent, if there is any evidence that Tommy's emotional is being compromised, I will not hesitate to modify this arrangement." He paused significantly, and I want to be absolutely clear. If modification becomes necessary, it will be in a direction that prioritizes Tommy's over either parent's preferences. Do I make myself clear? Both Sarah and David nodded. Judge Reeves then looked at Officer. "Officer, I want to thank you and Duke for what you have done here today. You have reminded this court of something essential, that sometimes justice requires us to move beyond procedure and reconnect with the human reality of the cases before us. This family will benefit from the gift you have given them." Officer nodded respectfully, and Duke seemed to sense the acknowledgement, his tail moving in a slow, deliberate wag. Judge Reeves looked back at Tommy, who was watching him with the unself-conscious attention of a 5-year-old. "Tommy, I want you to know that today, you have done something very important. You have helped 2 adults understand what truly matters. You have helped them begin to think about your needs instead of their anger. That takes real courage." He then addressed the courtroom at large. "This case has taught me something that I will carry with me for whatever time remains in my judicial career. Justice is not simply the correct application of law. Justice is the pursuit of what will help human beings heal, grow, and flourish. Sometimes that requires us to step outside our standard procedures and ask the fundamental question: what is truly in the best interest of the people before us?" He raised his gavel slowly. "This court is adjourned. The custody arrangement outlined above shall take effect immediately. A written order will be filed within 48 hours. I will see all parties again in 6 months to assess progress." The gavel came down with a sound that seemed to reverberate through not just the courtroom, but through the very souls of everyone present. Something had fundamentally shifted. A judge had opened his heart. A family had been given a chance to heal. And a 5-year-old had demonstrated that sometimes the voice that matters most is the one we most often fail to hear. 6 months had passed since that transformative day in Judge Reeves' courtroom. The seasons had changed, autumn giving way to early winter. The world had continued its relentless rotation, but for one family, the implications of that single day continued to ripple outward, reshaping their lives in ways both subtle and profound. The community center's auditorium was packed for the annual Police Department Appreciation Ceremony. Local dignitaries occupied the front rows: the mayor, city council members, and various community leaders. Behind them sat police officers, firefighters, and other first responders, along with family members of those honored. The walls were decorated with photographs of officers engaged in community service, testimonies from citizens they had helped, and statistics about crime prevention and community safety. But for Sarah Mitchell, who sat in the 3rd row of the auditorium, the ceremony held a meaning far deeper than civic recognition. She had brought Tommy with her, not just because she wanted to honor officer service, but because Tommy had specifically requested it. Her son had been transformed by his connection with Duke, and Sarah understood that being here, witnessing the public recognition of the dog and his handler, was important to Tommy's ongoing healing. Sarah looked at her son, and her heart filled with a quiet joy that she had not allowed herself to feel during the dark years of separation and conflict. Tommy sat beside her, his posture straight, his expression attentive and peaceful. He had grown in the past 6 months, not just physically, though he had definitely gotten taller, but emotionally and psychologically as well. The anxiety that had characterized him during the custody battle had largely dissipated. His nightmares, which had plagued him in the months after his parents' separation, had become rare. His grades, which had suffered during the most intense period of conflict, had returned to excellent levels. But the most profound change was in his ability to be simply, peacefully present. He no longer carried the weight of his parents' emotional struggle. He no longer felt responsible for their happiness or their pain. Sarah had learned through her own therapy, mandatory therapy that, while initially resented, had become genuinely transformative, that children absorb the unspoken emotional burdens of their parents. By addressing her own issues, by learning healthier ways to manage conflict with David, by consciously releasing Tommy from the responsibility of fixing her emotional pain, Sarah had given her son a gift that no custody arrangement alone could have provided. David sat 3 rows behind Sarah with his own girlfriend, Maria. His presence at this ceremony had surprised Sarah, but as she had come to understand through her therapy and co-parenting classes, David's motivation for attending had nothing to do with Sarah. He was here because he loved his son. He was here because he understood, finally, that parenting meant showing up for the important moments in Tommy's life, not as a strategic move in a custody battle, but as a genuine expression of love and commitment. The 6 months since that courtroom decision had forced both Sarah and David to confront themselves in ways they had been avoiding for years. The mandatory therapy had been initially uncomfortable, then gradually more helpful as they each worked with licensed counselors on their own issues. David's struggle with anger and feelings of failure, Sarah's anxiety and her tendency to use Tommy as an emotional support system. The anger management classes had provided practical tools for managing conflict constructively. But perhaps most importantly, both parents had a fundamental shift in perspective. They had stopped seeing the other parent as an adversary and started seeing each other as co-parents united in a single shared mission, Tommy's. That shift had not happened overnight. It had required consistent effort, ongoing support, and willingness to let go of the grievances that had fueled their conflict. The custody arrangement that Judge Reeves had implemented had proven remarkably effective. Tommy spent school weeks with Sarah, which provided stability and consistency for his academics and social life. The Tuesday and Wednesday evenings with David had given Tommy regular, predictable contact with his father during the week. The alternate weekends allowed for extended, quality time. And critically, both parents had made genuine efforts to refrain from speaking negatively about the other parent, to support Tommy's relationship with his other parent, and to present a united front regarding expectations and boundaries. On stage, Officer stood at a podium, about to accept an award for distinguished service, but before he could begin his speech, he gestured for someone to join him. Duke walked onto the stage with perfect composure, his police badge gleaming under the bright lights. The audience responded with applause and warm laughter at the sight of the magnificent dog. "Before I accept this award," Officer began, his voice carrying through the auditorium, "I want to share a story that illustrates why I believe Duke and I do this work. 6 months ago, we were called to a family court proceeding to provide a calming presence for a sensitive witness, but something more important happened in that courtroom that day." He paused, his eyes searching the audience. When he located Tommy, his expression softened. "A 5-year-old child spoke his truth to my dog. He articulated his pain, his love, his confusion, his needs, all because Duke provided him a safe space to do so. That child's words not only transformed his own family, but also transformed a judge who had been interpreting justice through legal procedure for 30 years. Duke didn't know he was doing anything special that day. He just showed up as his authentic self, offering presence without judgment." Officer looked directly at Tommy. "This award belongs to Duke. This award belongs to that 5-year-old boy who had the courage to speak his truth. And this award belongs to the judge who had the wisdom to listen." The audience applauded, and Officer placed his hand on Duke's head affectionately. Tommy, watching from the audience, smiled broadly, a genuine, uncomplicated smile of pride and connection. After the ceremony concluded, There was a reception area where the honorees could meet with community members. Sarah had taken Tommy to the reception specifically to thank Officer in person. As they approached, Officer broke into a warm smile and immediately bent down to be at Tommy's eye level. "Hey, buddy," he said warmly, "how have you been?" "Good," Tommy replied, his confidence evident. "I wanted to tell you that Mommy and Daddy are not broken anymore." Officer's expression filled with genuine joy. He looked up at Sarah, who nodded through tears. "It's true," Sarah confirmed. "We're still working through things. We're definitely still learning. But Tommy's right, the broken feeling is gone. We're building something new, something healthier." David approached from across the room, having deliberately waited for an appropriate moment. The interaction between Sarah and Officer had been cordial and warm, without any hint of tension. David extended his hand to the officer. "Thank you for what you and Duke did for us," he said simply. "For my family." Officer shook his hand firmly. "All I did was show up with my dog. Your family did the real work." Judge Reeves had also attended the ceremony. He stood on the other side of the auditorium, watching the interactions between Tommy, his parents, Officer, and Duke. When he made eye contact with Sarah, he smiled and nodded with a warmth that transcended judicial formality. He had kept his promise to monitor the case. 6 months earlier, at the follow-up hearing, he had observed the changes in both parents, heard from Tommy about how much better he was doing, and decided that the custody arrangement should remain as structured, with the understanding that another check-in would occur at the 1-year mark. As the evening progressed, Tommy moved between his parents with comfortable ease, showing each of them his favorite parts of the ceremony program, talking enthusiastically about Officer and Duke. Neither parent was trying to monopolize his time or extract his loyalty. Both were simply present, available, genuinely interested in his experience. Duke, ever the intuitive presence, seemed to sense the family's transformation. When Tommy came to sit beside him for a photograph, the dog leaned gently against the boy, his tail moving with slow, deliberate sweeps. In that moment, Tommy, Duke, with his parents standing nearby in a unified stance of support, something crystallized. The family had not returned to what it had been before the separation. That version of the family, built on unspoken resentments and unresolved conflicts, was gone forever. Instead, they had built something new, a family restructured around authentic communication, genuine healing, and commitment to each other's rather than competition for power. Later that evening, as Sarah drove Tommy home, she asked him a simple question. "Tommy, do you remember what you said to Duke that day in the courtroom?" Tommy thought for a moment. "I said, 'Hi, friend,'" he recalled. "And do you remember what happened after that?" Sarah asked gently. "I told Duke everything," Tommy said. "I told him how I felt, and he listened. And then everyone else started listening too." Sarah reached over and squeezed her son's hand gently. "You were very brave, sweetheart. Your words helped a lot of people." Tommy gazed out the window at the passing city lights. "Is everyone not broken anymore?" he asked. Sarah smiled, tears once again forming in her eyes. "Yes, buddy, everyone is not broken anymore. We're all healing, we're all learning, and we're all going to be okay." In the weeks and months that followed, the ripple effects of that transformative courtroom day continued to spread. Judge Reeves began incorporating therapy dogs into other custody cases, always with the consent and input of the families involved. His approach to family law began to shift, becoming less adversarial and more focused on genuine healing and family reconstruction. Word spread through the legal community about the judge who had fundamentally reimagined how custody decisions were made. For Tommy, Duke, and Officer, the connection forged that day remained strong. They saw each other occasionally at community events, and each time, Tommy greeted Duke with the same pure joy and connection. The dog had become, in many ways, a symbol of the family's transformation, a living reminder that sometimes the most powerful tool for change is simply authentic presence and genuine listening. And for Sarah and David, though they would never be romantic partners again, they had become something arguably more important: genuine co-parents, united in their commitment to their sons, modeling for Tommy that love and respect could coexist even when romantic relationships ended. They had learned that justice was not about winning, but about healing. And they had learned that sometimes it took a 5-year-old child and a therapy dog to teach a judge and an entire family what truly mattered. The broken family was broken no more.